3 policemen lay dead in the Australian bush. A reward larger than almost any in colonial Australia had been offered. And one young outlaw was about to become the most famous criminal in Australian history. More than a century later, the name Ned Kelly still divides opinion. To some, he was a ruthless murderer. To others, a folk hero who stood against corruption and injustice. This is the story of Australia's most infamous outlaw. Edward Kelly was born in December 1854 in the small Victorian settlement of Beveridge. His parents were Irish immigrants who had come to Australia searching for a better life. But life was far from easy. The Kelly family lived in poverty, struggling to survive on the harsh colonial frontier. When Ned was just 12 years old, his father died, leaving the family in desperate circumstances. As the eldest son, much of the responsibility fell upon his shoulders. The hardships of his childhood would shape the man he would become. In colonial Victoria, Irish families were often viewed with suspicion by authorities. The Kellys were no exception. Police frequently monitored the family. Tensions between the Kellys and local law enforcement grew year after year. By his teenage years, Ned had already been arrested several times. Whether he was unfairly targeted or willingly embraced a life of crime remains a matter of debate. But one thing is certain. The conflict between Ned Kelly and the police was escalating. Everything changed in April 1878. A police constable named Alexander Fitzpatrick arrived at the Kelly family home. What happened next remains one of the great controversies of Australian history. Police claimed Ned Kelly shot Fitzpatrick in the wrist. The Kelly family insisted the officer was drunk and exaggerated the incident. Whatever the truth, the consequences were devastating. Ned's mother, Ellen Kelly, was arrested and sentenced to prison. For Ned, this was the breaking point. He disappeared into the bush, and he was not alone. Joining Ned were his younger brother, Dan Kelly, along with Joe Byrne and Steve Hart. Together, they formed what would become known as the Kelly Gang. They knew the Victorian bush better than the police who hunted them, and soon the authorities would learn just how dangerous they could be. In October 1878, police tracked the gang to a remote location known as Stringybark Creek. The confrontation that followed would change Australian history. Gunfire erupted among the trees. When the shooting ended, 3 police officers were dead. Only one survived. The colony was shocked. Newspapers demanded justice. Police launched one of the largest manhunts Australia had ever seen. The Kelly gang had become the most wanted men in the country. Yet not everyone saw them as villains. Among struggling farmers and poor settlers, support for the gang began to grow. Many believed the Kellys had been persecuted by corrupt authorities. To these supporters, Ned Kelly became a symbol of resistance, a rebel standing against a system stacked against ordinary people. The legend was beginning to grow. The gang soon carried out a series of daring bank robberies. At Euroa and later at Jerilderie, they seized control of entire towns. Witnesses often described the gang as surprisingly polite and disciplined. Unlike many criminals of the era, they rarely harmed civilians. At Jerilderie, Ned dictated a document that would become famous, the Jerilderie Letter. More than 7,000 words long, it was his defense against the accusations made against him. A declaration of anger, a declaration of defiance, and perhaps the closest thing we have to Ned Kelly speaking in his own voice. As the police hunt intensified, the gang prepared for what they believed would be a final confrontation. Using stolen plough moldboards, they crafted suits of homemade armour. Heavy steel plates protected their heads and bodies. It was an extraordinary creation, part genius, part desperation. The armour would become one of the most iconic symbols in Australian history. By June 1880, the gang had arrived at the small town of Glenrowan. Their plan was ambitious. They intended to derail a police train and spark a rebellion, but the plan failed. A local schoolteacher managed to warn the train before disaster struck. Soon, police surrounded the Glenrowan Inn where the gang had taken hostages. A fierce gun battle raged throughout the night. Then, out of the darkness, came a sight officers would never forget. Ned Kelly emerged wearing his homemade armour. Bullets struck the steel and bounced away. For a moment he seemed unstoppable, almost supernatural. But the armour had one fatal weakness. His legs remained exposed. Police opened fire. Ned Kelly fell. The legend was over. Inside the burning Glenrowan Inn, the remaining gang members met their fate. Dan Kelly, Joe Byrne, Steve Hart, all were dead. The Kelly gang had been destroyed. Only Ned remained alive. Wounded and captured, his final chapter was about to begin. Ned Kelly was taken to Melbourne jail. He was tried for murder. Despite petitions signed by thousands of supporters, the sentence was inevitable: death by hanging. On the morning of November 11th, 1880, Ned Kelly walked to the gallows. He was 25 years old. Some say his final words were, "Such is life." Whether he actually spoke those words remains uncertain, but the legend has endured. More than 140 years later, Australians still argue about Ned Kelly. Was he a murderer, a victim of circumstance, a rebel, or a hero? His story has inspired books, films, paintings, songs, and documentaries. His armour remains one of the most recognisable artefacts in Australian history, and across Victoria, visitors still travel to places like Beveridge, Greta, Glenrowan, and the cemeteries connected to the Kelly family. Searching for traces of a man who became far more than an outlaw. He became a legend. History rarely gives us simple answers, and perhaps that is why Ned Kelly continues to fascinate us. A poor bush boy, a wanted criminal, a symbol of rebellion, a man whose story refuses to die. Whether remembered as villain or hero, Ned Kelly remains one of Australia's most enduring mysteries, and perhaps he always will.